Hey y'all, Andrew here with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans, and today I'm going to share some tips on how to explore New Orleans cemeteries. The city is famous for its tradition of burying people above ground. It's part of our legacy as a French and Spanish colony, makes us really unusual in the United States, and it makes our cemeteries destinations for their design and their history. There are dozens of them across town, so I'll be sharing some of the best ones to visit, options for seeing them on a tour or on your own, what to expect during a visit, and how above ground burial works. And when you're done, check out the video description for lots of useful links. First, getting a tour of a cemetery is a really common choice. As beautiful as these places are, they're not very self-explanatory, and they also can be huge, so a guide helps you narrow it down to the highlights. And most of those tours take place in one of three cemeteries. First is St. Louis Cemetery number 1. This is the most famous cemetery in the city, and it's the oldest one that's still standing. It's been taking burials since 1789. Back then, the city was, at least on paper, all Catholic, so it's a Catholic cemetery owned by the church. But that being said, its claims to fame include a tomb that belonged to Marie Laveau, a famous voodoo priestess, and it was also the setting for the movie Easy Rider. If your intro to New Orleans geography was The Princess and the Frog, you might expect that cemetery to be right in the middle of the French Quarter. But believe it or not, the oldest cemetery is not in the oldest neighborhood. It's a little outside of it because they believed that the bad smells from cemeteries caused diseases. So that means a typical French Quarter tour is not going to go to that or any cemetery. And entry to it is also very restricted. Used to be, not long ago, that anyone could go inside, but after a big spike in vandalism, the church decided to close it to the public. Today, only one tour company has access, and more's the pity, it is not us. Look for that link down below. Another commonly visited cemetery, and the third oldest one still standing, is Lafayette Cemetery number 1 in the Garden District. It's pretty different from St. Louis 1. You'll see a lot of Anglo, Irish, and German names instead of French and Spanish ones, and it's owned by the city, not by a church. It's also the one you're likeliest to know from on screen. It's been in Interview with the Vampire, both versions, Double Jeopardy, the originals, and a New Kids on the Block music video. As far as visiting this cemetery, Lafayette number 1 closed for repairs in 2019, and as of right now, it's still closed. Because it's right in the heart of the Garden District, the vast majority of walking tours in that neighborhood do visit it, including the one that we do at Free Tours by Foot. Right now, that means a view from one of the gates, but there's been a lot of change around this cemetery in the recent past, so for up-to-date information about how to access it, check the links in the description. The third cemetery you'll usually see tour companies visiting is St. Louis number 3. This one you'll mainly see included on bus tours. In the course of usually a 3-hour itinerary, they'll take maybe 15 or 20 minutes there to let you stretch your legs and see the sights, and bike tours sometimes stop there and walk inside too. And unlike St. Louis 1, a guide isn't required to visit that one. If you prefer to explore on your own, St. Louis 3 is a great choice. There's a lot of beautiful sculpture, you might recognize some famous names like Chef Paul Prudhomme, and it's close to City Park, the New Orleans Museum of Art, Bayou St. John, lots of stuff you could easily pair with it, all located right around the end of the City Park and Museum streetcar line. So those are the 3 cemeteries where you'll most often see tours offered. But there are lots of other interesting ones, so next I'll share a few others you might visit on your own. Tours are also available of some of these via companies that specialize in cemeteries, so check out Red Sash Tours or Save Our Cemeteries for those options. If you're visiting New Orleans and staying in or near the French Quarter, the easiest way to visit cemeteries on your own is to take a streetcar named Cemeteries. You can catch it on Canal Street, and it ends in the midst of 14 different cemeteries of all shapes and sizes. The ones right around the streetcar stop, like Greenwood Cemetery and Cypress Grove, are great cross sections. They've got tombs ranging from very basic to very elaborate. The showiest tombs are a short walk away in Metairie Cemetery. We've made a couple of videos about that one if you want more details. Metairie highlights how expensive above-ground burial can be, and a couple of the other cemeteries in this area show the other end of the spectrum. One of those is the Katrina Memorial on Canal Street. The location used to be a site for unmarked burials for people who died in the care of our charity hospital. What you mainly see now is a memorial to Hurricane Katrina that doubles as a mausoleum for those killed by the storm and its aftermath who were never identified. The other in that category is Holt Cemetery. Holt is a low-cost, city-owned cemetery where most burials are in the ground, and they're marked with whatever a family can afford, and that includes homemade markers. Some aren't marked at all, including most famously the grave of Buddy Bolden, the first jazz band leader, who's buried somewhere in Holt, but no one knows where. Jumping to a different part of town, one of the most memorable cemeteries in the city is St. Roch Cemetery No. 1. It's another Catholic cemetery, and besides just being beautifully designed, it also has a Gothic chapel built into it, plus statues representing the Stations of the Cross. It's in a residential neighborhood, but visitors to town are likeliest to find themselves near it while spending time in the Marigny or Bywater neighborhoods. Finally, as you might have guessed from there being a St. Louis No. 1 and No. 3, there's also a St. Louis No. 2. It's the second oldest one in town, but it's easy to miss. It's sandwiched in between a big mixed-income housing development and a highway overpass. It doesn't get a lot of visitors, but it's got some great local history, including a massive tomb where a guy had his entire will engraved to make sure his money went to his favorite charities and not his kids. St. Louis 2 is also closed to the public as of now, with no information available about when it's going to reopen. One last thought when it comes to tour options. Mostly, whether you're on a tour or on your own, you'll only be able to get into a cemetery during its open hours. Those are specific to each one, but they're always during the day. The only way to visit one of our cemeteries at night is to take a tour with one of a couple of companies who've gotten special permission to access a cemetery after dark. And they'll usually do that as part of a bigger itinerary by bus. And we have a blog post about them. You'll find those linked down below. Restriction to visiting during the day is far from the only rule in New Orleans cemeteries, so next I want to share some guidelines for how to enjoy a visit while also taking care of the place and the people who use it. First, as much as New Orleans cemeteries are visitor attractions, they're still first and foremost for the people whose loved ones are buried there. Every cemetery in town, even the oldest, still gets used for burials or by people visiting their loved ones. Those folks are often not in a great place to engage with strangers, but we keep our cemeteries open because we trust people to, by and large, do the right thing, like picking up after yourself, keeping respectfully quiet, and giving mourners some space. It's also possible that you might see a funeral, maybe even a jazz funeral, although those don't happen every day. And in that event, we just ask that you limit yourself to observing respectfully from a distance and err on the side of not using your camera. That said, there's nothing wrong with taking photos of tombs or names or statues that catch your eye, and video is usually fine too. Here we are doing it right now. Speaking of trust, many tombs in this city are multiple centuries old. They're basically museum pieces without the glass. So we also ask visitors not to touch tombs, and that includes leaning or sitting on them. Finally, bear in mind that different cemeteries are run by different groups, from churches to the city to private companies, so rules and practices are going to vary. Catholic cemeteries, for example, specifically ask people not to bring food, which isn't a bad idea generally, and they also close off tour access on holidays like All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. So before you visit a cemetery, it's worth looking at the web presence of the specific one you've got in mind and making sure that your plans line up. What you generally won't see on cemeteries' web pages is any explanation of our above-ground burial thing. So next, I'll share some basics of types of tombs and how they work. Mostly what you'll see in our cemeteries is family tombs. Those are the ones that look like little houses, although they also can get a lot more elaborate, and they often have a family name written across the top. Usually they have 2 burial vaults behind a front plaque. Each of those vaults can be used for multiple burials. They get very hot on the inside to the point that bodies buried in them biodegrade faster than normal, and the bones of one person eventually get moved to the back of the vault or to an underground compartment so as to make room for the next person. That's why the plaque covering those 2 vaults often has way more than 2 names on it. Family tombs can be pretty expensive, so you'll also see other types that are at least partly about reducing cost. One way to reduce costs was to share it, and that led to a type we call society tombs. Those are owned by an organization and used by its members. Usually they're bigger than family tombs, so they'll stand out, and while they rarely have the names of the people buried inside engraved on them, they do show what those people shared in common. They might have been firefighters, or health workers, or priests. They might have been members of a Masonic lodge, or a club formed by former enslaved people, or they might have immigrated to New Orleans from the same place. If you were an individual or a family that didn't have those kinds of connections, then your more affordable choice would have been a wall vault. Some cemeteries built burial space into their walls to maximize on real estate, and those too could be reused, so you'll see anywhere from 1 to a dozen names on those plaques. The other common type of burial you'll see is copings. Those are a compromise between burial in the ground and above the ground. They look kind of like raised flower beds, either open on top or covered. Finally, y'all, even if you don't try to visit a cemetery, there's a small chance you might walk through one without realizing it. I'll explain in a second, but really quick. If you'd like to see more of the cemeteries, we have a video tour of St. Louis number 3, another one of Metairie Cemetery, and a walk through Metairie Cemetery without commentary, just scenery. And if you're planning a trip, we have lots of other travel tips on the channel too. If you found them helpful and you feel inspired to tip your guides, you can find the links to do that down below. Thank you. Okay, so accidental cemetery visits. I said St. Louis number 1 is the oldest cemetery in town, but it wasn't the first. It was built to replace St. Peter's Cemetery, which was inside the French Quarter. At that time, we weren't burying above ground yet, so even though the block is completely built over today, the burials are mostly still down there, and once in a while, some hapless resident decides to dig. Most recently, someone was digging for a pool in 2011 and accidentally unearthed 20 burials. And as much as that might sound like the setup for a horror story, it actually ended really happily. Archaeologists got called in to analyze the site. They found some stuff that became part of a museum exhibit. The bodies got a memorial ceremony and got reinterred in St. Louis number 1. And the owners of the site got to advertise a haunted swimming pool on their Airbnb listing. The other time you might be unwittingly stepping into a cemetery is when you're maybe least likely to be thinking about historic architecture, which is when you're visiting a Saints game. The area where our football stadium is now was one of the first parts of the city used by Anglo-American transplants in the early 1800s, and in 1820 they set up the city's first Protestant cemetery called the Girard Street Cemetery. It's long since been torn down, and in this case the bodies were moved elsewhere, but the site is now a parking garage for the Superdome. And the idea that the Superdome might be haunted offers one possible explanation when the Saints don't do so well. Y'all, cemeteries inspire some strange stories, and one of my favorite parts of giving cemetery tours has always been hearing other people's stories about strange graves, where they came from, burial practices in their part of the world, all that stuff. So if you've got a story, the comments would be a great place for it. Thanks for sharing and for watching. See you next time.